Hi, my name is Janneke Adema and I'm an assistant professor at the Center for Postdigital Cultures at Coventry University. So I'm a researcher who explores the future of the book, but I also support a variety of scholar-led not-for-profit publishing projects, including the Radical Open Access Collective, Open Humanities Press, Scholar-led and Post Office Press. And I'm also the co-PI on COPIM, the Community-led Open Publication Infrastructures for Monographs project.
Hi, my name's Joe Deville. I'm a lecturer at Lancaster University and also one of the co-founders of the open access book publisher Mattering Press.
In this video, we're going to attempt a digitally mediated conversation on the relationalities of care in open access publishing.
Our conversation will be structured around 4 questions. First, why care in open access publishing?
Second, where is care in open access publishing?
Third, how to do care in open access publishing?
And finally, what are the limits of care in open access publishing?
After that, we'd very much welcome your questions and comments. Okay, so on to our first question.
In many ways, publishing itself can be seen as a form of care. It is about communicating and sharing our research with our wider community, with the wider public, to further build and expand this public. This is especially the case with open access publishing, which makes the argument that there shouldn't be any pay or reuse barriers for others to access our research. However, a lot of care labor is involved in enabling us to share this research. This care labor extends to our means of creating, publishing, and communicating research, so the platforms and infrastructures that we use, to our working conditions as scholars, so the institutions of which we are a part, and to our relations with others, and these others include our publishing objects, our books and publications. What is important to highlight is that for many of the publishing projects and practices which both I and Joe will present here today, such as Mattering Press, the Radical Open Access Collective, Scholar-led, Pirate Care and COPIM, caring for these means, these conditions and these relations of publishing involves an active intervention in and transformation of the systems and infrastructures which we use to conduct and publish our research. Especially since scholarly publishing has historically, and open access more recently, especially in the global north, been rendered further complicit with neoliberalism's audit culture of evaluation, measurement, impact and accountability. So in this context, care involves moving away from the market-driven incentives frequently used to justify open access, such as that open access will deliver better value for taxpayers' money or will grow the knowledge economy, to focus instead on the values that underpin experiments in open publishing and scholarly communication, such as diversity and equity and indeed care. So the projects that Joe and I will discuss today show how an ethics of care can help to counter the calculative logic that otherwise permeates academic publishing. Here, rather than concentrating on scholarly products, objects and outputs, these initiatives want to instead draw attention to the relationalities of publishing. For them, a commitment to an ethics of care entails understanding publishing as a complex, multi-agential and relational practice, recognizing that we have a responsibility to all those involved in the publishing process. Caring for the relationships involved in this process is crucial, from rewarding or otherwise acknowledging people fairly for their labor, wherever possible, to redirecting our volunteer efforts away from commercial profit-driven entities and to instead support more progressive, not-for-profit forms of publishing. But it also includes taking care of the non-human, not just the published object itself, but all those animals, plants and minerals that help to make up the scholarly communication ecosystem. Such an ethics of care presents a potential alternative to the hegemony of specific forms of relationality in contemporary publishing, ones in which the logic of the commodity tends to be imposed on all social relations. Care has the potential to help offset and engage with the calculative logic and metrics-based regimes that permeate academic publishing infrastructures and increasingly determine how we relate to one another. What is important here is that a lot of historical care work within scholarly publishing falls outside of what is valued within this calculative logic. So practices such as reviewing, editing, editorship, mentoring, building networks, building relationships with and intervening in the outside world, and with that I mean beyond rigid definitions of what within academia is valued with impact narratives. With the rise of these kinds of calculative logics, care practices start to fall by the wayside, and care is increasingly directed towards our own individual practices, outputs, and metrics, not towards building up solidarity with the various collectivities in which we function, which is what caring should be all about. As Samuel Moore states, in highlighting the relational nature of publishing practices, the employment of care as a guiding principle represents a move towards considerations of the community over the individual. This is a key facet of care, which represents a critique of liberal individualism by emphasizing relationality and interdependence over rational individualism and calculation.
What I guess I'd like to add to this conversation is the suggestion that an ethic of care might supplement an ethic of openness in scholarly publishing. As Janneke mentioned, care might help us challenge calculative logics and the logics of the commodity that continue to dominate scholarly publishing practices. However, we can also observe that these logics are by no means incompatible with an ethic of openness. Commercial, closed access publishers are increasingly using openness not only rhetorically but also practically in their activities. It may not always be something that sits comfortably with their more established ways of operating, but these publishers have shown themselves to be highly resourceful when it comes to adapting their ways of working in the face of openness, the challenge of openness, notably by generating new revenue streams via the charging of APCs and BPCs, article and book processing charges. The challenge of openness, then, has not fundamentally changed the underlying logics of profit-seeking that characterise commercial publishing. It's instead merely led to a shifting of the sites where profit-seeking activities occur. As I'm certainly not the first to point out, we cannot therefore rely simply on opposing closure with openness to solve the problems of publishing. As Nate Katz has observed, the, quote, seeds of closure are already always present within the open. And we can see all kinds of ways in which thoughtless openness has the potential to create a whole host of new problems. There are many reasons why publishers might want to work very hard to keep closed off some of the conversations it has with authors, early drafts of work, uncaring reviews, by way of just some examples. Within the work done by Mattering Press, therefore, we quickly realised, and did so fairly instinctively, I guess, that an ideal of openness is capable of doing only some of the practical, intellectual and ethical work that we're hoping to achieve. An ethic of care emerged for us as a helpful interlocutor with an ethic of openness. We initially drew our interest from the field of science and technology studies, which is more or less where we locate ourselves as a press, notably from the work of Anne-Marie Moll, who counterposes a logic of care to a logic of choice. Although it should be said we also drew our influences from a range of other places, notably the extensive feminist work on an ethics of care. I'm thinking of the likes of Nell Noddings and Virginia Held, for example. As Janneke mentioned, a logic of care is interested in relational connectivity. This, as a publisher, means being attentive to the specific and situated challenges posed by engagements with others, whether those be humans or non-humans, and I'll talk more about this shortly in relation to infrastructures of publishing. A logic of choice, by contrast, is the logic that characterises market relations and which is being implied in an increasing variety of contexts. In this logic, there is a presumption that the best outcome in a particular situation comes from individuals deciding, perhaps self-interestedly, between alternatives. In a scholarly context, this leads to the transformation of scholarly publishers into monopolising profit centres, of students into consumers, and of universities into commercial institutions in competition with one another, subject to all the troubling vagaries of ranking systems and all kinds of other internal and external assessments of quality. It is our contention as a publisher, and also the contention of many of those with whom I work on a range of other projects, that an ethic of openness does not on its own have the moral and practical force to challenge the logic of choice. This is why we contend we also need a logic of care. Okay, so when it comes to the where of care in open access publishing, as I've already begun to suggest, I think it's really helpful to move our attention beyond a focus just on the human relations that sustain publishing practices to also include the non-human. And I guess what I want to suggest here is that in doing this, it's really helpful to think a little bit more deeply about the infrastructures of open access publishing. And this is obviously a topic that's been addressed, I guess, consistently by various people in their attempts to understand, I guess, the promise of open access publishing. Very famously, Geoffrey Bilder, Jennifer Lynn, and Cameron Naylan, in their Principles for Open Scholarly Infrastructures, suggested that, quote, everything we have gained by opening content and data will be under threat if we allow the enclosure of scholarly infrastructures. Now, I'd very much agree with them. The where of care in open access publishing is not just in the relations between us, between publishers and readers and authors and reviewers, for example, but also in the relations that we variously have to some of those non-human entities that sustain open access publishing. However much I agree with Bilder and colleagues in many respects, I do want to draw attention to the very specific dictionary definition of infrastructure that they work with. So infrastructure as, quote, the basic physical and organisational structures and facilities, for example, buildings, roads and power supplies, needed for the operation of a society or an enterprise. And I guess what I want to suggest is that when it comes to thinking about where care is in open access publishing, we may want to expand this definition of infrastructure. So compare it, to example, to this definition provided by Sandra Colkins and Richard Rottenberg. They're both social scientists working broadly in the field of science and technology studies, which is where I more or less locate my own work. So they define infrastructures as, quote, experimental material semiotic practices interweaving social, economic, political and legal orderings with moral reasonings and technical networks that inevitably produce new and unpredictable assemblages that reconfigure the world. So this definition also addresses basic physical and organisational structures, but at the same time it addresses how these intersect with human relations. These are the meanings that we collectively assign to, in this case, infrastructures. So the semiotics of infrastructures. It also includes political orderings, moral reasonings. Infrastructures, in other words, are not neutral, but rather have the potential to either support or challenge dominant understandings of how things ought to be done. From definitions like this, and I guess the broader work on infrastructure in the field of science and technology studies and beyond, I think we can pull out three ways in which, or three areas where we might want to start to identify where care can do some important work in open access publishing. First, this means, I guess, thinking about the fact that a care for infrastructures might require a shift from a focus on infrastructures alone to broader processes of infrastructuring. So this means attending not just to what is being built, which is of course very important, but what relations are exactly being put into play? What relations between organisations, individuals, materialities, data, and society more broadly? And second, and following from this, that infrastructures are always situated in particular contexts. And I guess when thinking about the where of care, we need to attend to this situatedness. So situated in particular communities in relation to particular historically specific moral, political and economic logics. And third, I guess in relation to all this, that infrastructuring is always provisional. So despite the tendency for infrastructures to come to be seen as unchanging and unchangeable, they are of course being constantly remade by the various individuals and organisations involved in constituting them, and of course the various other relations that are being put into play. So what this means is that the building, the reinforcing, and in some cases the challenging of infrastructures is an ongoing process. Indeed, of course, in the world of scholarly communications, it is this very hope that infrastructures are provisional that continues to animate the open access movement and animate, I'm sure, many of the presentations in this conference. At the same time, of course, we continually confront the continued resilience of infrastructures, particularly those that are, I guess, undergirded by commercial logics. So I guess the task for us is to think more broadly about where infrastructures are, and that will, I think, help us identify some of the places in which we can intervene, and intervene more productively in the constitution of a more open network of scholarly communications.
So where does care lie? I would like to follow up from what Joe mentioned with respect to the non-human relations of care established through publishing. Where Joe focuses on infrastructuring as one of the processes that sustain scholarly communication, I would like to focus on how care is established around the objects through which our research is published, namely our publications. How do we care for our books and journals? How does care extend to the published object itself, and how are relationships and communities established around and through this? As scholars, we obviously care for our publications and want to ensure they are well and clearly written or performed, and that they reflect our arguments, our research subjects and objects and case studies in the best way possible. But many other relationships of care are established around publications beyond that between authors and their books. In this respect, Tahani Nadim, an editor at Mediterranean Press, sees books as affiliative objects, as objects within the publishing process that mediate and modulate relationships. Mercedes Boons, one of the editors of Maison Press, a cooperative press focusing on media theory and digital culture, argues that a sociology of the invisible would have to incorporate infrastructure work, which means that care for the published object needs to include the work of acknowledging, accounting for, and crediting everyone who is involved in producing a book or a journal. As she explains, a book isn't just a product that starts a dialogue between author and reader. It is accompanied by lots of other academic conversations, peer review, co-authors, copy editors, and these conversations deserve to be taken more serious. As such, the book can be seen as a form of interaction between different agents and constituencies. Although it is often seen as the endpoint, it can also be seen as a nodal point around which these relations of care between authors and readers, publishers, editors, and reviewers circulate. When we understand publishing as a complex, multi-agential, relational practice, then focus starts to be on how to better foreground these various agencies involved in knowledge production. But this also includes an acknowledgement of the role played by non-human agencies in the production of books, from paper to screens, ink, printers, trees, and Amazon warehouses, and by the book itself as a specific material form, be it printed or digital, in the relations it interweaves as parts of its processual becoming, materially, geopolitically, environmentally. Or, as Gary Hall states, all those distributed, heterogeneous, humans, non-humans, objects, non-objects, and non-anthropomorphic elements that collectively contribute to the emergence and history of an ink on paper and card book. Following Sam Moore, care is in this sense relational rather than end-directed. It is a situated practice. And for many of us, these care practices are situated around the publications we collectively produce, which, as ever-evolving nodes in this network of relations, at the same time again shape us as scholars and shape the specific relations of care that are fostered around them. So some of the projects I've been involved in focus in specific on the question of care and care practices. So one of these is the Radical Open Access Collective. Set up in 2015, this is a community of mainly scholar-led, not-for-profit, presses, journals and other open access projects. So the collective promotes a progressive vision for open access based on mutual alliances between the 60+ members and seeks to offer an alternative to legacy models of publishing. So based on the contingent and diverse philosophy of radical open access, the collective mainly means to work towards a framework of resilience, of strength in diversity and in numbers. As a philosophy, radical open access does not stand in opposition to open access, or even to more neoliberal forms of open access. It is more a repositioning of open access, bringing it in line with its roots, with how it was initially conceived by academics and librarians, where open access has always also been about rethinking scholarly communication and critiquing the hegemonic role and exorbitant profits of commercial presses. So radical open access seeks to push back against the dominance of these market-driven versions in order to promote non-commercial and not-for-profit scholar-led approaches to publishing. As such, radical open access positions open access as an affirmative and ongoing critical project, meaning that it's not one thing, model or overarching project, a specific philosophy or a set of principles. It consists of various groups, peoples, institutions, and projects with their own affordances. It embraces experimentation with academic publishing and writing, with the form, content, and process of academic knowledge production. It involves the recognition and nurturing of underrepresented cultures of knowledge, from para-academics to precarious scholars and academics from the global south. So the projects experimenting with these more radical forms of open access tend to envision their publishing outlook within and as part of a relational ethics of care. Now, this involves highlighting the importance of making publishing more diverse and equitable, so geographically, but also with respect to issues of class, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. It involves nurturing new and historically underrepresented cultures of knowledge, so those associated with early career, precariously employed, and para-academics, or located outside the global north of west. And it involves ensuring everyone is able to have a voice, not least those writing on niche or avant-garde topics, who are conducting hybrid, multimodal, experimental forms of research, and who are currently underserved by a profit-focused commercial publishing system. But it also involves the sharing of resources, of information, skills, and time, building up the collaborative communal knowledge already available within the different publishing projects and gifting this to the community. So the website and information platforms set up by the collective provide information for those interested in starting their own open access projects. It lists resources about the collective, resources related to scholar-led publishing, and a directory of scholar-led presses. So this effort towards resource and skills sharing characterizes the larger scholar-led publishing community as a whole, where there is a focus on knowledge sharing overall and on mentoring of smaller or newer initiatives, of co-publishing and community and consortium forming on various levels. In this respect, the Radical Open Access Collective embodies what Samuel Moore and I have characterized as horizontal forms of collaboration, forging alliances between small independent projects. This is an important step in creating economies of skill and in providing mutual aid and logistical support, shared services, and best practices. So the latter lines up with one of the key principles used by the Pirate Care Collective and research project, which they use in the introduction to their collaboratively written syllabus on the corona crisis, to frame care as a political notion. They state, "Caring labor needs full access to resources, knowledge, tools, and technologies. When these are taken away, we must claim them back." Now, this is ever so important in the context of scholarly communication and the commercialization of knowledge, tools, and technologies. But it's not only about claiming back resources, tools, and technologies, or providing open source versions. It is also about fundamentally reimagining the workflows, infrastructures, and relationalities that make up scholarly publishing, to enable relations of care and care labor to be sustained.
I guess what I'm going to do now is more or less continue where Janneke left off when she was talking about how to potentially reimagine the workflows, infrastructures, and relationalities of publishing. So with my work at Mattering Press, we've sought to do that, not always successfully, but something we're continually seeking to do in thinking about how we might bring an ethic of care to the book, how to make the books worth buying and so on, how to bring an ethic of care to open access as a movement, to our writers, to I guess our readers and to those with whom we work, those without a direct stake in academic knowledge production, the typesetters, web designers, proofreaders, and so on. But what I want to, I guess, focus more on is some of the other projects that I've been working on recently with other open access book publishers. The first of those was a project funded by OpenAir called New Platforms for Open Access Book Distribution. This involved a new collaboration between 6 publishers, so Mattering Press and Mission Press, and Open Book Publishers, Open Humanities Press, Punctum Books, and Mayfly Books, and was an attempt to think about ways of generating infrastructures that might help us move away from an over-reliance on book processing charges, which some of us continue to rely on. This led to a number of outputs, and some of these are actually ongoing. The first of those was a metadata database, which was a database that ultimately will enable us to create a shared catalogue and involved all kinds of ways of harmonising our metadata across the different publishers. So again, this is us starting to potentially speak in something closer to one voice. Another, I guess, output was a shared conference presence. This, in some ways, was a kind of more a symbolic output than anything else. So this is a conference presence that you can unbox, and it showcases the work from all the participating publishers. I guess this sort of showcases an ethic that was crucial to the project, and that was the value of collaboration over competition. We see ourselves very much not in competition with one another. If anything, we're in competition with the far larger and more dominant commercial closed access publishers that as I say, dominate the terrain of scholarly publishing. Another output was the scholar-led collective. So this again was something that enabled us to speak with a different and more collective voice via Twitter. So we established a Twitter handle which has generated a fair amount of attention in the world of scholarly publishing, and a web page and so on, and have written a number of collaborative pieces on that. And I guess the third output was actually the injunction to attempt to continue working together and see if we could get some funding to do so. This led to a £2.8 million bid to Research England, and actually a further top-up bid to the Arcadia Foundation for a project titled Community-Led Open Publishing Infrastructures for Monographs. And this involved a range of other partners, the UCSB Library, the Digital Preservation Coalition, JISC, and so on. Very happily, this bid was successful. And I just want to give an overview of what this project is all about, because in some ways I think it kind of epitomises what care for the book might actually look like if you have the potential financial resources to support that. So we, I guess, divided our attention between a range of different aspects in terms of the infrastructures that are required to support open access publishing. So the part of the package that I'm involved in is one called Revenue Infrastructures and Management, which aims to develop the infrastructure for a community-led, fully open consortial funding model to enable libraries to support open access book publishers. And this builds on the moves in this direction by the likes of Open Book Publishers and the Open Library of Humanities. The second was interested in knowledge exchange and piloting alternative business models, exploring all kinds of ways of strengthening the channels of communication that exist between diverse stakeholders that make up or could make up the landscape of open access publishing. And this includes, most importantly, helping established publishers transition to the kinds of open access business models that we are keen to support. The third was thinking about community governance. If, as I've suggested, infrastructures are inevitably political, then in our view it has to be the scholarly community broadly defined, including, for example, libraries, scholars, learned societies and so on, that control these infrastructures. And this part of the project aims to research and consult on and develop the policies and procedures needed to support the various forms of activity that we're involved in. The next work package is interested in creating an open dissemination system. Think about the technical protocols needed to better integrate our books into institutional libraries to enable our books to be found and to disseminate more easily amongst the general public and potentially amongst scholarly libraries. The next work package is interested in experimental publishing and reuse and impact. So thinking about expanding the potential definition, I guess, of what an academic book is, and thinking about the practical, intellectual and technical challenges that this involves. And the final, I guess, area of focus was thinking about archiving and digital preservation. So thinking about how to actually meet the highly complex challenge of preserving open access books in all their complexity, including developing the relevant standards and best practices. So this, I guess, is what caring for the book looks like. It involves caring for all these dimensions of open access book publishing, and it's something that I'm very excited to be involved in with Janneke, and hope to be able to come back and report about what we do. So the reason that I wanted to talk about the limits of care is because I didn't want us to give the impression that we thought that care was in any way a simple solution to the problems of publishing, or the more specific problems of open access publishing. So what I'm going to do now is just run through 3 areas where I think that care might have its limits, or certainly where care can be challenging to put to productive use. The first of those is where care sits in tension with, and can at times become overwhelmed by, other non-caring logics. Many of us in the COPIM project and in the associated scholar-led consortium, work, as the name suggests, in academic-led presses. And we do so at a time in which the Academy has been shown to be behaving in all kinds of uncaring ways. This, of course, was at the heart of the recent industrial action in the UK in higher education. Just by way of some examples, a number of colleagues at Mattering Press are still in precarious or para-academic positions, despite this not being their first choice. Some of us with more stable contracts struggle with the expectations that our institutions place on us in relation to administration or teaching. All this combines to make publishing a difficult activity, and especially to do publishing in quite the way that we would want to. Related to this are all kinds of other non-caring logics that currently dominate academic life, notably logics of speed or logics of impact. This is often translated for us as academics into the pressure to publish. This puts further constraints on our time in combination with some of those other pressures that I mentioned earlier. It also affects our authors. They can become hesitant to publish open access because of worries about how compatible this might be with instrumental logics of internal and external assessments of research quality. Engaging in careful publishing can also mean being willing to allow a text to emerge relationally in sometimes iterative dialogue with reviewers and publishers. Not only can this be slow, although some closed access publishers are also sometimes slow and sometimes problematically so, but this is a process that can be difficult and fraught with tensions. The second area is where care confronts institutional lock-in. We're a book publisher and we rely on a range of highly institutionalised third-party services, notably Lightning Source to produce our print-on-demand books, Amazon to sell hard copies of our books to readers, and hopefully soon Google Books to do something similar. We also confront institutional lock-in in relation to channels of funding, notably libraries, and how and whether libraries can direct some of their resources to support open access book publishing. Now, this is something we're explicitly challenging in the Coping project, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of funding to even attempt to do so. That's not to say that we shouldn't try, but this is an enterprise that is inherently wearing. Really caring for publishing infrastructures, therefore, is, I would suggest, an inherently uncertain business, in which the futures that you're constantly trying to create can often feel simultaneously tantalisingly close and just out of reach. And the third thing I'd like to talk about is the way in which I would suggest care is not something that can be simply conveyed. At Mattering Press, there have been some occasions, I would quite openly admit, where our attempts to proceed carefully have broken down, and this has led to tensions with authors and editors. I'm thinking in particular about a dispute around a book cover. In these instances, what we have thought of as acting carefully has been interpreted quite differently by those that we work with. Anne-Marie Moll argues that the logic of care has, quote, no separate moral sphere. That's to say, it's not a set of values that can be cleanly applied to a particular setting. Rather, care, for the very reason that it's constituted relationally, emerges in and through practice. A commitment to care, therefore, does not mean making the world as you would want it to be, but rather being committed to dialogue, to negotiation, to trial and error and experimentation, and sometimes to difficult and painful struggle, but hopefully with the ultimate aim of reaching shared and mutual understanding. This requires compromises from publishers, compromises from authors, and some of the others that we work with. As Anne-Marie Moll says, being for care is perhaps above all being for, quote, a sticky combination of adaptability and perseverance. And in this respect, I and my colleagues at Mattering Press and in the Coping project are, we hope, adapting and persevering. This means that we're working things out, but crucially, we're doing so with others.
Care, of course, has many limits, and limiting care is often the ultimate act of caring. This becomes especially clear where it concerns one of the prime non-caring logics, as Joe phrases it, within academic publishing, namely the extent of volunteer labor that academics do for commercial publishers, within a gift economy context, which is often neither rewarded nor acknowledged, but instead exploited to gain higher profits for shareholders. So again, we're talking here about the volunteer work we do as reviewers, as editors, as board members, as copy editors, and as marketeers of our own work. This essential care that so many of us provide to sustain our profession, our communities, our universities, is a resource that is all too readily taken advantage of. Now, many calls have gone out in the past to demand this kind of volunteer or hidden work is either formally acknowledged or fairly remunerated, especially since, although they concern calculations from more than 10 years ago, and exact calculations are really hard to make due to how untransparent the process is. In 2008, the cost of peer review alone has been calculated at more than £1.9 billion. However, I want to emphasize that I don't think the solution here lies in extending this form of care work into, as I outlined earlier, the logic of calculation. That is, by simply adding it to the realm of paid or waged labor. On the other hand, there are calls to recognize the volunteer publishing work that we do in a different way and to value it and recognize it instead as a form of scholarship within our institutions. In other words, to seek direct university support. Now, this strategy revolves around arguing that publishing is a part of our scholarly work and not something that we should outsource, to recognize it as an activity that benefits scholarship and that we hence value. However, beyond these two strategies, I want to highlight a potential third route of limiting or redirecting care, following strategies around refusal of work, as theorized within autonomous Italian thinking and Marxist and feminist theory, including by thinkers such as Kathi Weeks, Silvia Federici, and Valeria Graciano. So refusal of work theories, which are often framed more around concept of waged and unwaged work rather than volunteer work, also often focus on this dual strategy of either gaining entry into the wage system to show the value of the work we now do voluntarily, or gaining social recognition within universities of this volunteer work, emphasizing what it does to sustain scholarly publishing and research more in general. Now, the issue with both these strategies is their failure to inherently challenge the dominant legitimating discourse of commercial publishing. In other words, how the system itself needs to change. Instead, a more interesting strategy might be to explore how we can produce and sustain value and perform care work independent of capitalist relations of production and centralized power. So this strategy is focused more on challenging the systems of production that sustain commercial academic publishing. Refusal of work is formulated here as a collective political project that questions the calculative relations of exploitation that underlie publishing more in general. It is directed at the larger system of commercial publishing, which is designed towards the exploitation of labor and accumulation of profit for stakeholders, instead of for the scholarly community. It asks, how can we provide our care labor to sustain the commons instead of it being under control of commercial entities? And finally, this third strategy of refusal of work is directed at moving away from logics of work and calculation in general, towards reimagining and transforming institutions, relations, and infrastructures, towards commons-based forms of publishing, which involve and require the invention of new ways of organizing and sharing our work and of making it meaningful. Sharing time freely and gifting labor is something that underscores many radical open access projects. As part of a refusal of work strategy, various scholar-led and not-for-profit publishing projects actively redirect their volunteer labor towards more progressive forms of publishing. For example, by shifting it away from commercial, profit-driven publishers and gifting it to developing not-for-profit open access projects instead, as Mattering Press is doing, as well as the members of the Radical Open Access Collective, Scholar-led, and COPIM. What is needed to enable this is first and foremost a reimagining of what academic collectivity, community, and commonality is and could be in a digital publishing environment. By developing an ethics of care, supporting the collective advancement of scholarship,
and building digital knowledge commons, these projects are actively reimagining the relations within the publishing system.
I hope you found that interesting. We'd very much welcome your questions and comments.